All right, guys, so I got a question from Jesse Johnson on my Patreon site about how to work a knot on the back of an Osage stave. He actually sent me a picture of a knot that he was working, just had a few questions, so I thought I'd take a few minutes just to answer that question and then also just make a video about it so that I can answer it for everyone. I've got an Osage stave here with a bunch of small knots on the back. The picture that Jesse had sent was of a fairly good sized knot, but it doesn't really matter because you work them all the same way. Now on this stave, I've gone ahead and pretty much followed one ring except for around the knots. So I'll follow one ring, take everything down to one ring, and then leave extra wood around these knots. So I have islands of extra wood around every single knot. Now what I'm going to do is come from the outside of those islands, working my way in until there's no wood left around these knots. Now I'm going to primarily be using a draw knife, and when I get very close to the knots, I'll just use a sheath knife, or a cabinet scraper with a curved edge works really well as well. So let's get started. So this is my backing ring here that you can see exposed all the way around this knot. And then there's a little pin knot right here, and then there's an island of wood around this pin knot. So I've got my lowest ring here, there's a ring above it right here. And so now that I have this knot isolated and there's an island of extra wood, I'm just going to work from the outside in towards this knot. Now I want to make mention of how I'm using this draw knife. You can see that this draw knife has a flat edge and a beveled edge. I'm using this thing with the bevel down. That becomes very important when you start working around knots, because you can use the back edge of this bevel and tilt your blade up or down to change the pitch of the cutting edge or change how aggressive this thing is. Now when you come up to this knot, the wood is going to swell. It's going to be like a little volcano. It's going to come up like this. Now you want your blade to follow that wood as it comes up. So as I'm coming up to this knot, I'm going to tilt the back of my blade down so it rides up that slope. So I've got a piece of an industrial planer blade here from a sawmill, and I just want to use this to show you what I'm talking about when I'm talking about using a draw knife bevel up or bevel down. This is just kind of like a jumbo version of a draw knife. It's got a flat side, and then it's got a side with a bevel on it. So when you use a draw knife with the bevel up, like you see here, it doesn't matter. You can't change how aggressive this thing is by changing the pitch, because even if it's laid all the way down, your cutting edge is still really pointed down into the wood. It's still very aggressive. If you flip it over and use it bevel down, you can use this edge right here to pivot off of, and that'll change how aggressive your knife is. This is how a draw knife is designed to be used. Notice how when I come up to the knot, I'm tilting the edge of the back of that blade down. You don't want to just rake your knife across that knot, because if you do, you're going to tear that grain out on the back side of that knot and violate the ring that you're trying to follow. So all this stuff I cover in detail on both my Patreon site and in my book. So if you're wanting very detailed instruction on bow building, I'd encourage you to check those two things out. Another thing that I'm doing is when I get right up to the knot, I'm pulling the knife off, and that kind of chips this wood out. Now when you get around to the edges of this thing, you can't really work your knife this way, so you just get as much as you can, and then on the edges you can just use your scraper or a knife and just kind of work it like that. And you can use it the same way. You can feel the difference between those two rings. When you get into that early wood stuff, cut through that late wood and get into the early wood, you can feel it crunching. I've got another little teeny tiny little pin knot right there I want to be careful of. And then when you get the majority of it, just start using your knife as a scraper. And you can use the curve of your scraper to get into this little recess where this thing starts to slope up. And if you leave a little bit of this wood around these knots, it's not going to hurt anything. It's just an aesthetics thing. So now I'm just going to come from the other way, start shrinking this island down. Being careful not to rake across the top of the knot. You see, I'm using that bevel on that knife to follow the contour of the wood. Now, I mentioned this little pin knot that I've got right here. And so I've got this knot and I've got another little pin knot. And in between those things, there's going to be a little swale or a valley. Now, I'm not going to be able to, come across this knot because I'll tear out on the back of it. So I have to use my knife to kind of dig out that little valley and make sure I don't violate the green. And again, just use your tool to scrape and clean everything up. There you go. All that extra wood around these two little knots here is removed. Everything else can be just cleaned up with sandpaper. Now, I would warn you against taking like a real coarse grit sandpaper and going across this, because you basically do the same thing. If you take the top off this knot, you're exposing end grain and you're violating that ring. So just use your sandpaper, go in between them, go around them, but don't just take a block with 60 grit paper and just go across the top, because you're going to violate that ring. So all this stuff I cover in detail in both my book and on the Patreon site. I'd like to thank everybody that signed up for the Patreon site. So if you're into bow building, you want some very detailed instructions, I would encourage you to check that out. There's a lot of exclusive content over there that talks about building bows. Covered mostly Osage right now. I've done some hickory stuff, but we're doing everything from takedown bows to all sorts of self bows, flat bows, long bows, recurves, and everything in between. So With that, appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.